Between June and October 1940, the greatest air battle ever seen was fought in the skies over England and the English Channel. In the Battle of Britain, the German Luftwaffe and the British Royal Air Force waged a bitter struggle for aerial supremacy that lasted almost 4 months. The Battle of Britain wrote a new chapter in the history of warfare. For the first time, a major conflict was fought by air forces alone. The outcome was settled not by armies of millions, but by a handful of men on each side, armed with the most advanced weapons of their day. Fast monoplane fighters, mounting multiple machine guns or cannon. Advanced bombers, some capable of ranging over 1,000 miles. Radar, a revolutionary air defense system never before tested in combat. The Battle of Britain was a trial, not only of the courage and skill of fighting men, but of the scientific and technical ingenuity of the warring nations. For Nazi Germany, the great prize in this epic contest was to have been a clear path for an invasion of England. In fact, at the hands of the RAF, the Third Reich would suffer its first major defeat. The months following the German blitzkrieg in Poland saw an uneasy lull all along the Third Reich's western borders. There were occasional artillery exchanges across the Franco-German frontier, but behind the elaborate defenses of the Maginot Line, France felt utterly secure. If there were to be a German attack in the west, it was generally believed it would be directed first at Belgium. To meet it, the cream of the French army and a British expeditionary force of 150,000 men waited on the Belgian border. With the expeditionary force was the bulk of the British Army's transport and heavy weaponry. The force also had several squadrons of British fighters, and some were already seeing action against German aircraft intruding into French territory. While the Allies waited for the inevitable attack in the west, Hitler struck to the north. Norway and Denmark were invaded by land, sea, and air. Denmark fell quickly, while Norway put up a determined but hopeless resistance. Even before the Norwegian campaign was over, the countdown to blitzkrieg in the west had already begun. German armies were massing on the frontiers of France and the Low Countries. The storm broke on May the 10th, 1940. The German offensive opened with more than 300 Luftwaffe bombers attacking 22 Allied airfields in northern France, Belgium, and Holland. Paratroops seized vital border defenses. At the same time, the ground assaults began. The German strategy was a two-pronged attack. First, Army Group B with 29 divisions advanced into Holland and northern Belgium. The intention was to lure the British Expeditionary Force and the best divisions of the French army to the northeast, out of their prepared positions. Meanwhile, the main German striking force, Army Group A with 45 divisions, including 7 armored divisions, pushed into southern Belgium and Luxembourg. Outflanking the fortifications of the Maginot Line, they crossed the wooded hills of the Ardennes, an area believed by the Allies impossible for tanks to penetrate. The drive through the Ardennes culminated in a decisive breakthrough. On the 13th, the River Meuse was crossed, the last natural barrier before the open spaces of central France. Within days, the Germans had torn a gap in French lines 50 miles wide and were racing westwards. Nothing could stem the German advance. Fierce air battles raged over France and Belgium, but the Luftwaffe quickly gained the upper hand. By May the 15th, the French Air Force was already collapsing, and the British had lost more than 200 aircraft. In the dash across France which followed the crossing of the Meuse, the panzers covered 200 miles, virtually unchecked. By May the 20th, German armored spearheads had reached the Channel coast. The Allied armies had been cut in two, and the war had swept to within 50 miles of the British mainland. Soon, the British Expeditionary Force and the bulk of the French 1st and 7th Armies were caught in a shrinking pocket around the port of Dunkirk. The successful evacuation of the expeditionary force from Dunkirk would be seen in Britain and around the world as a towering achievement. But the fact remained that in France, Britain had suffered dreadful losses of men and equipment. Most dangerous of all, the battle had severely weakened the Royal Air Force. Almost 1,000 RAF aircraft had been destroyed, more than half of them fighters, and already, from Norway to the west coast of France, the Luftwaffe was establishing itself on the airfields of its conquered enemies. With the fall of France, Hitler had achieved all of his immediate war aims, and had achieved them with a speed that astonished even himself. In Hitler's mind, the war was over, at least for the time being. Not only had he made no plans for dealing with continued British opposition, but for many years he had nurtured deep misgivings about war with the United Kingdom. To Hitler, the defeat of Britain would only serve to hand her empire to the United States and Japan. Now, with the British powerless to intervene on the continent, they would surely come to some kind of arrangement. Anything else, Hitler believed, would be simply irrational. Increasingly impatient, Hitler waited for news that Britain was willing to make peace. But compromise never came. On July the 2nd, he finally ordered his generals to prepare preliminary plans for an invasion. And on the 16th, he ordered the plan put into effect. The operation, codenamed Sea Lion, was to be ready by mid-August. Yet even at this stage, Hitler was hoping that the threat of invasion itself would be enough to force the British to negotiate. Above all others, it was Winston Churchill who was the driving force behind Britain's refusal to come to terms with Adolf Hitler. Appointed Prime Minister on the very day that Germany invaded Western Europe, Churchill had been a compromise candidate for the leadership, and his authority was far from complete. Many of his senior colleagues believed that his hardline rejection of Hitler's peace overtures was suicidally obstinate. Churchill had no such doubts. For many years, he had warned of the threat posed by Nazi Germany, and now he announced that Britain would fight. Churchill understood that any German invasion attempt would depend on the Luftwaffe winning mastery of the air, and that only the RAF's fighters could prevent them doing so. To increase Britain's fighter strength, Churchill created a new government department, the Ministry of Aircraft Production, and put at its head an energetic and talented newspaper tycoon, Lord Beaverbrook. Through Beaverbrook, Churchill could ensure that even while his air marshals demanded bombers, fighter production was given the highest priority. As the great test of the Battle of Britain drew closer, Churchill, in spite of his stirring oratory, had yet to gain the complete confidence of the British people. What sustained him in this, the greatest crisis in Britain's history, was his own unshakable belief that victory would come.
To resistance and revolt. And if driven to desperate hazards, he attempts the invasion of the British Isles, as well he may. We shall not flinch from the supreme trial. Lift up your hearts. All will come right. Out of the depths of sorrow and of sacrifice will be born again the glory of mankind.
In overall command of Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of England, was Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the man who had overseen the decisive flanking drive through the Ardennes, which had won the Battle of France. The invasion plan called for 2 army groups, altogether over 250,000 men, to land on the shores of Britain. Von Rundstedt's Army Group A, made up of the 16th and 9th Armies, with 10 divisions and 650 tanks, was to embark in harbours between the estuaries of the Scheldt and the Seine. Protected at sea by U-boats and minefields, they would land on a strip of the English coast between Folkestone and Brighton. Part of the 9th Army would also land in the Isle of Wight, Portsmouth area. At the same time, parachutists would be dropped to cover the flanks of the invasion beaches. To the west, a secondary landing was to be mounted by the 6th Army of Army Group B. Sailing from Cherbourg with 3 divisions in its first wave, 6th Army, its flanks also covered by parachutists, was to land in Lyme Bay and advance northward towards Bristol and the Severn Estuary. After a week consolidating their beachheads, the invaders would push forward to take the high ground along an arc from the Thames estuary to Portsmouth. In a second phase, London was to be cut off from the west and encircled, and the whole of southern England occupied up to a line running from the Severn to Malden in Essex. The sheer quantity of shipping required for Operation Sea Lion, 155 transports and 3,000 smaller craft for the first wave alone, meant that Hitler's orders to be ready to invade in mid-August were impossibly ambitious. The Navy protested that assembling the ships would take until at least the middle of September, nor could it guarantee to protect the invasion flotilla from Britain's powerful home fleet. To the Army's dismay, the Navy was insisting that the landings be restricted to a narrower and much more easily defended front. On only one subject were the German Army and Navy in full agreement. No invasion could succeed unless the Luftwaffe won complete control over the skies of southern England and the English Channel. The prospect of the invasion fleet being bombed and strafed as it crept towards England was a nightmare, and only German air power could prevent interference by the Royal Navy. Operation Sea Lion therefore depended totally on the destruction of Britain's air force. The Luftwaffe, flushed with its recent victories in Europe, was supremely confident that it could achieve that objective. The first phase in the German air offensive was to be a series of bombing attacks on British merchant ships in the Channel, mounted from airfields in France and Belgium. Britain was to be faced with a major dilemma: send fighters to defend the convoys and have them shot down by German fighter escorts, or lose the ships. After the preliminary stage of gradually wearing down British fighter strength, the full-scale assault would begin. The Eagle offensive would involve massive raids on RAF fighter fields and sector stations. Aircraft factories would also be hit. Within 4 days of the launch of the offensive, the Royal Air Force would have to abandon its southern airfields for sanctuary further north. Another 4 weeks would annihilate the remnants of the RAF's fighter strength. The way would be open for invasion. If British air and sea power were unable to beat off a German invasion fleet, the nation's survival would depend on the British Army. After the evacuation from Dunkirk, the Army had only 786 field guns and 167 anti-tank guns. There were only 2 armoured divisions, one of them incomplete, and altogether Britain had little more than 200 tanks heavy enough to take on the German panzers. The Army plan for defeating a German invasion depended heavily on infantry and on fixed defences. From Berwick-on-Tweed to Weymouth, coastal areas up to 20 miles deep were closed to the public, sown with mines and fenced off with barbed wire. Across Britain, a series of defensive stop lines was created, made up of pillboxes and linked anti-tank obstacles. At the heart of the defences was the GHQ line, covering London and the industrial Midlands, on which all of Britain's anti-tank guns were sighted. Later, a less wasteful and more flexible strategy was adopted. Mobile infantry formations were established on the coast, and the emphasis on lengthy defence lines was replaced by the fortification of key road junctions and strategic points. If the worst happened, and Britain were invaded, every available able-bodied man was expected to join in the fight. The local defence volunteers, the part-time force later renamed the Home Guard, had by now over 250,000 men, but was pitifully short of weapons. Few expected that against the seasoned veterans of the German army, it would stand much of a chance. Nevertheless, the force could play a useful role by relieving the regulars of the more mundane tasks of manning minor roadblocks and doing local guard duties. In anticipation of the battles to come, 127,000 civilians were evacuated from the east coast, and another 80,000 moved from the Kentish coast. Plans were already being laid to bomb the invasion beaches with poisoned gas, and experiments were carried out with underwater fuel pipelines, which would set the sea and the beaches ablaze as the German invasion flotilla approached. British planners knew that any German invasion must be preceded by a massive air assault. The RAF strategy would be to conserve its fighters as an effective force, no matter what the provocation. Every raid must be met with just enough strength to deflect the raiders from their target and perhaps destroy some bombers, but no more. In this, Britain's most important asset would be its highly secret radar defense system. The radar stations of Chain Home stretched from the north of Scotland to the westernmost tip of Wales. The system was capable of detecting aircraft to a range of 120 miles. However, it could not detect low-flying intruders. To fill the gap, stations operating on a shorter wavelength were added to the system. Chain Home Low could detect aircraft up to a distance of 50 miles. Whenever a radar station or group of stations detected aircraft approaching the British coast, the information was passed directly to Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory. At Fighter Command, the job of evaluating radar reports, estimating ranges, and deciding whether detected aircraft were friendly or hostile was done in a filter room, staffed mainly by members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. There, counters representing enemy and friendly aircraft were moved around a giant plotting table. The filtered information was passed next door to the Fighter Command operations room, and there an identical plotting table was updated, and a decision was taken about which fighter groups were to be called in to the defense. Britain was divided into 4 Fighter Command groups. 13 Group in the north, its headquarters at Newcastle. 12 Group in the Midlands, commanded from Watnall. 10 Group was in the southwest, with its headquarters in Box. And 11 Group, the group likely to take the brunt of German attacks, was in the southeast, its headquarters at Uxbridge. Every group headquarters had its own operations room, its plotting table updated minute by minute with information from Bentley Priory. A duty controller decided which of the sector stations under his group's command should meet the raid and how many fighters should intercept. On orders from the group controller, the sector station's fighters were brought to a state of readiness or scrambled for an interception. In the sector operations room, plotters tracked not only the course of enemy raiders, but also the positions of intercepting RAF squadrons. While inland of the radar net, these were known by means of a system called Huff Duff, or pipsqueak. in which radio signals, automatically emitted by the fighters, were tracked by the sector station. The sector controller could then direct the leader of each fighter squadron to his target, giving by radio the enemy's position, height, course, and estimated numbers. Once enemy raiders had crossed the British coast, they could no longer be tracked by radar, and technology gave way to the eyes and ears of the Observer Corps, a vast civilian organization made up mostly of part-timers. From posts all over the country, observers, armed with binoculars and a crude direction finder, reported the course, position, and identity of all aircraft within their area. On cloudy days, all this had to be judged from the sound of aircraft engines alone. Observer reports were passed to the Corps' own filter center at Horsham, and from there to Fighter Command Group and Sector Operations Rooms. Britain's air defense network was meant to ensure that RAF aircraft would have no need to fly wasteful standing patrols in the hope of catching sight of an enemy. Whenever the fighters flew, they would fly to combat. Fighter Command's entire strategy depended upon the proper functioning of this new and relatively untried system. In June 1940, no one could tell how such a complex machine would fare in the chaos of an all-out battle. It was Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding who had devised Fighter Command's defensive strategy for the Battle of Britain. Dowding had been appointed Chief of Fighter Command on its creation in 1936. He was the man responsible for the RAF's decision to opt for metal monoplane fighters, and he had quickly seen the promise of radar. He went on to create the network of filter and operations rooms, observers and controllers that transformed primitive radar into a functional weapon. Once a course of action had been decided upon, Dowding would follow that course without swerving. In the Battle of France, he had already proved his mettle by resisting moves to send more fighters to the continent. By so doing, he antagonized Churchill, but succeeded in saving aircraft that Fighter Command could ill afford to lose. In the Battle of Britain, Dowding's strategy of conserving his fighter strength would again face serious opposition. The battle would be a trial, not only of Dowding's air defense system, but also of his belief in his own policy and his determination to see it through to the end. Air Minister of the Reich and Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, was the man charged by Adolf Hitler with destroying the Royal Air Force and paving the way for an invasion of Britain. During the Great War, Göring had become one of Germany's most famous fighter aces, winning the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest decoration, and succeeding Baron von Richthofen as commander of the renowned Flying Circus. A close friend and ardent supporter of Adolf Hitler from the earliest days of the Nazi Party, Göring wielded enormous power in the Third Reich. As well as commanding the Luftwaffe, he was Prime Minister of Prussia and the President of the Reichstag. Alone amongst the Nazi hierarchy, Göring affected an aristocratic style. He lived in a castle, dressed flamboyantly, and was devoted to hunting. After the fall of France, he spent little time on Luftwaffe business. Instead, he was scouring the museums of occupied Europe for works of art to plunder. For his contribution to Germany's victories, Hitler created for Goering the unprecedented military rank of Reichsmarschall. Yet the triumphs of the Luftwaffe had owed little to Goering's own thinking. He believed uncritically the theories of those who claimed that bombers, by breaking the will of the enemy, were capable of winning wars alone. As for fighter tactics, the limit of Goering's interest was to exhort his flyers to shoot down as many enemy aircraft as possible. Goering was completely confident about the battle ahead. He saw his orders to destroy the RAF as another chance to prove the mettle of his Luftwaffe. To Goering, the needs of the German army and navy in the run-up to Operation Sea Lion were irrelevant. The Luftwaffe would wage its own war. In the days following the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk, RAF Fighter Command was desperately trying to bring its forces to battle readiness. Every squadron suffered from some kind of shortage. Many pilots had been lost, and many aircraft had been damaged or were in need of servicing. Some squadrons had only half their establishment of ground crew, while less than a third of RAF fighters had been fitted with IFF, a new device designed to identify British aircraft to the radar network. Amongst the chaos, there was one ray of hope. Production of Hurricanes and Spitfires in June was 446 aircraft, more than 2.5 times the level of only 3 months before. On July the 6th, Britain had 688 modern single-seat fighters, 2/3 of them fit for combat, and another 450 in reserve. The Hawker Hurricane, a monoplane fighter built of wood, fabric, and a tube metal framework, had entered service with the RAF in late 1937. Although the Hurricane was a halfway stage between the old wood and fabric biplane and the new generation of metal aircraft, in the hands of a good flyer, it was an effective weapon. During 1939, the Hurricane had been extensively modified. The aircraft's fixed pitch, two-bladed propeller had been replaced by a two-pitch, three-bladed type, and its wing had been covered with a metal skin instead of fabric. The result was a dramatic increase in performance. Armor protection was also fitted. Armor was placed first between the pilot and the engine, and later behind the pilot as well. At the instigation of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, the aircraft was given a bulletproof windscreen. These additions meant that the man flying a Hurricane was far better protected in combat than any German fighter pilot. During the Battle of Britain, the Hurricane's rugged simplicity would pay valuable dividends for RAF Fighter Command. The aircraft would prove quick to manufacture, damage resistant, and easy to repair. The Hawker Hurricane quickly won the trust and admiration of the men whose task it was to fly it. The aircraft was a delight to handle, and its wide track undercarriage made for particularly safe landing and takeoff on rough airfields. More than 2/3 of RAF fighters deployed in the coming battle would be Hurricanes. The Supermarine Spitfire was an advanced, all-metal monoplane fighter with a monocoque fuselage and a stressed metal skin. For speed, the Spitfire's wings were extremely thin, yet their characteristic shape gave them the maximum area and great strength. The Spitfire had entered RAF service in August 1938. Its design called for new and complex manufacturing techniques, particularly in the forming of the wings, and in consequence, production of the aircraft in numbers was painfully slow. By the time of the Battle of Britain, far fewer Spitfires would be available for squadron service than the RAF had hoped. The Spitfire was fast, maneuverable, and very responsive to fly. The Spitfire's performance was unsurpassed at low and medium altitudes. A feature particularly admired by Spitfire pilots was its bubble canopy, which gave a superb all-round view, a priceless asset in a dogfight. In early July 1940, RAF Fighter Command had only 1,200 pilots. 435 experienced veterans had been lost in France, and until recently, the training schools were producing only 200 a month. It took almost a year to train a pilot in basic flying skills alone, and Fighter Command was painfully conscious that in an all-out struggle, losses could mount horrifyingly quickly. One solution was to expand the contingent of Commonwealth pilots in the RAF, and many flyers from Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and South Africa would fight in the Battle of Britain. There was also an influx of skilled flyers from the air forces of conquered Europe, including many Poles and Czechs. Some of these men would become the most dedicated and dangerous fighter pilots in the RAF. At the outbreak of war, part-timers from the RAF Volunteer Reserve and the Auxiliary Air Force had been immediately mobilized and would make up around a quarter of RAF strength. Although they could fly, they'd been given little training in how to fight. Even the training of regulars was of a very poor standard. RAF combat practice was always in strictly choreographed section or group attacks, while solo combat skills and marksmanship were badly neglected. Just as important as the fighter pilots were the RAF and civilian personnel responsible for keeping the aircraft at the highest state of combat readiness. A daily inspection was carried out on every machine, and after a sortie, as a squadron landed, each fighter was met by its ground crew, including an armourer and his assistants, a fitter, a rigger, and a radio mechanic. Aircraft were normally checked for damage, refueled, and rearmed in 35 minutes. Behind the ground crew were the maintenance mechanics, highly skilled men who serviced the fighters' overworked engines and airframes, often in very primitive conditions. The station workshops also carried out what repairs they could, but if the damage was too great, the aircraft was dispatched to the civilian repair organization. Under Beaverbrook's Ministry of Aircraft Production, the repair units achieved near miraculous results. Over 60% of all the fighters sent to the organization returned to combat. Complete fighters were made by cannibalizing damaged aircraft, and during the battle, 1/3 of all new fighters to reach the squadrons would come from repair units. While Britain's fighters were the major weapon against enemy raiders, the ground defences would also play an important part, mainly by forcing bombers to fly higher and so spoiling their aim. Anti-Aircraft Command, a branch of the army, was led by the energetic and effective General Sir Edward Pyle, who worked closely with Fighter Command. In July 1940, Pyle had only 4,000 guns, almost half of them light weapons, and about the same number of searchlights. At night, or on cloudy days, accurate shooting was all but impossible. There were few of the new gun-laying radars, and gunners had to depend on all but useless sound locators. The second component of the ground defences was a force of barrage balloons. Balloons were meant to discourage low-flying bombers, particularly at night, and were handled by a 12-man team made up of RAF personnel. Because the mile of cable connecting the balloon to the ground could easily be severed by an enemy aircraft without causing the raider to crash, a system called the double parachute link was devised to make the balloon a truly lethal obstacle. When hit by an aircraft, the cable would separate from the balloon and the winch. While the cable was being trailed by the aircraft, it would deploy 2 small parachutes, which would cause a sudden drag of about 2 tons, stopping the raider dead in its tracks. With the double parachute link, the barrage balloon was a powerful deterrent to low-flying bombers. However, in the summer of 1940, there were far too few balloons for an adequate defense. Only 1,400 barrage balloons were available to protect key sites around the country. The German campaign in Western Europe, although a triumph for the Luftwaffe, had not been won without cost. Almost 1,500 aircraft had been lost in combat and operational accidents in less than 2 months. Now, the force was expected to go on the offensive against Britain without the rest and replenishment it so badly needed. Although Goering believed that wars were to be won by strategic bombing, his air force had never been equipped to fulfill that role. The Luftwaffe had developed as a tactical weapon whose task was to support a ground offensive. It had numerous bombers, but the emphasis was on relatively short range types, able to carry only a modest load. Altogether, the Luftwaffe had 4,500 aircraft. Of these, almost 1,600 bombers and 1,100 fighters would be deployed for the battle, about 70% of them fit for combat. The Messerschmitt 109 was Germany's only modern single-engined fighter. Its overall performance was comparable to the Spitfire, but it was more effective at high altitudes and better in a dive. Unlike British fighters, which were fitted with carburetors, the 109 had fuel injection and could dive suddenly without stalling, an advantage many would use to evade opponents in the battle. Like the Spitfire, the 109's handling was heavy at high speeds. It had no tendency to spin, although its very delicate wings meant that German pilots were reluctant to turn as hard as their British counterparts. The aircraft's takeoff was extremely short, and its climb was excellent. But on the ground, the 109's narrow undercarriage and poor view made it a difficult machine to handle, and 5% of all 109s built would be destroyed in landing accidents. The Messerschmitt 110 two-seater was intended as a long-range escort fighter, the first aircraft of its type in the world. After its naval counterpart, it was known as a destroyer. Goering saw his destroyer squadrons as the elite of the Luftwaffe, and their pilots were the best available. But the aircraft would be a disaster in the Battle of Britain. Although formidably armed and much faster than the Hurricane, the 110 was too cumbersome a machine to take on the Spitfire. Before the end of the battle, destroyers would suffer the indignity of needing to be escorted by 109s. The Junkers 87 Stuka was designed as a precision dive bomber, whose main role was to support infantry actions. As long as it operated in areas in which the Luftwaffe controlled the skies, it was a formidable weapon, its bombing accurate to within 100 feet. The Stuka was fitted with sirens to strike terror into the enemy, and automatic dive brakes to pull it out of its steep attack. In spite of the Stuka's ungainly appearance, it handled well. Its controls were light, and for its size, the aircraft was very maneuverable. Cockpit visibility was excellent, but compared with single-seat fighters, the two-seater Stuka was slow and poorly armed. When it first entered service, the Heinkel 111 was one of the most outstanding aircraft of its day. By the time of the Battle of Britain, although it was still a formidable weapon and had been updated many times, the design was beginning to show its limitations. The 111 was heavily armored and well armed, but the aircraft was underpowered and slow. Because its bombs were stored vertically, the heaviest weapon it could carry in its bomb bay was only 551 pounds. The Dornier 17, known from its shape as the Flying Pencil, had already ceased production by the start of the Battle of Britain. The aircraft was limited in bomb load, speed and range. It also had no armor protection. In spite of all this, the Dornier remained popular with aircrew. It was the most reliable of all German bombers and was highly maneuverable. The aircraft was also structurally very strong and could bomb in a shallow dive at over 370 miles per hour. Because of their vulnerability, Dornier units favored low-altitude, terrain-following tactics to gain the advantage of surprise. The Junkers 88 had been designed at astonishing speed, and the Battle of Britain would see its first operational use on a large scale. The aircraft was admitted by the RAF to be the best warplane of its type anywhere, and it would remain Germany's most effective bomber. The Junkers 88 was fast, versatile, rugged, and highly maneuverable. It was poorly armored and armed, but its dive brakes would often allow it to escape, even from a Spitfire. Amongst the airmen of the Luftwaffe, morale was at an all-time high. Victory in Poland and the West had left them with the belief that the German Air Force was invincible. They had suffered heavy losses since the start of the war, but the force had an enormous number of combat-tested veterans, and the men knew that their training and tactics were superb. Fighter pilots learned to attack not only bombers, but other fighter formations, wing against wing, squadron against squadron, down to individual combat. Bomber crews were often trained together as a unit, and the captain of the aircraft, normally the observer, was taught to do the job of every other crew member, including flying the aeroplane. Pilots had up to 250 hours flying experience, including more night sorties than the pilots of any other air force. The Luftwaffe had been training 800 new pilots a month, since long before the war began. Like their RAF counterparts, German ground crew would be under enormous pressure throughout the battle. The whole Luftwaffe offensive would depend on them turning around bombers and fighters as fast as possible and keeping them in serviceable condition. The job would be made infinitely more difficult by the quickly improvised nature of many German airfields. Servicing work, including engine changes, often had to be done in the open, with the absolute minimum of facilities. Like their aircrew comrades, the morale of the men on the ground was high, but after 2 months of operations, and still laboring to establish 100 new air bases, they were badly in need of rest. On the production front, although few airmen knew it, the Luftwaffe had already lost its edge over Britain. In June, Germany had built fewer than 900 aircraft, including only 140 single-engined fighters, less than 1/3 of British fighter production. The Battle of Britain would begin in earnest on July the 10th, 1940, with Luftwaffe attacks on British Channel convoys. But even before the first phase of the conflict, the British people were to be shown that the Luftwaffe was within striking distance. Every day, the number of intrusions by German reconnaissance aircraft over England increased. The air defences were probed, and the response time of the RAF was measured. The next step was a series of night attacks on British factories, ports, and airfields. The first large-scale air raid on Britain was on the night of June the 18th. 100 bombers attacked targets in southern, eastern and northern England and South Wales. Before the end of the month, there were 8 more nights of bombing, the raiders ranging widely over the north, the Midlands and southern England, causing many civilian casualties. On July the 1st, German bombers mounted the first major daylight raid on Britain. The targets were Wick in Scotland and Hull in Yorkshire. From now on, the raiders would come by day and by night, and on both sides, losses would begin to mount. The deadly contest of grinding attrition that would become known as the Battle of Britain was about to enter its first phase.